يا صندوق سموا في الشهر مين هيدوق؟
يا بني لي بيتي
يا صندوق
يا زارع لي غيطي
يا صندوق
من غيرك انت عيشك وحيتي.
صندوق النقد يا صندوق
علمني اصنع وازرع واركع
لصندوق
وريني فين مصلحتي برطع.
يا صندوق
علمني اصنع وازرع واركع
لصندوق
وريني فين مصلحتي برطع.
يا صندوق
الحقني في عرضك كلشني بطردك ارتاح في بلادنا واعتبرها ارضك.
صندوق النقد يا صندوق
لو عندي نيل كان المواويل عن زرعة ماتت عن أمة تاهت عن زرعة ماتت
عن أمة تاهت
مين يزرع
لنا غير صندوق.
لو عندي ايد كان امحي زيد واعيش بكرامة مرفوع الهامة واعيش بكرامة
مرفوع الهامة
مين يرفعها لنا غير صندوق. يا معلي داري يا شريكي في افكاري يا معلي داري يا شريكي في افكاري يا مخطط مستقبلنا ومصادر قراري. يا شايف مصلحتي يا سايب ناكل براحتي يا جابر ايدي المكسورة يا جايب لبن العصفورة
مين يسقيهولنا غير صندوق.
امال الثورة دي قامت ليه؟
يا صندوق
واللي ماتوا كانوا ماتوا ليه؟
يا صندوق
فهمنا معنى الكرامة ايه؟
يا صندوق
ارفع راسك فوق دي تبقى ايه؟
يا صندوق
وكنا بنهتف يسقط يسقط ليه؟
يا صندوق
فهمنا الحرة بتاكل بايه؟ ايه ايه ايه؟
يا بحري وظيفة جنبي علينا يا بحري وظيفة جنبي علينا
يا حاطط ايدك في جيوبنا ومعلم علينا.
يا شريك حياتي يا مظبط ميزانياتي وعينه انت اللي شايلنا ومحقق لي امنياتي. مين هيحققها غير صندوق؟ صندوق النقد يا صندوق 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 صندوق النقد.
النظام وطننا العربي بيئات مختلفة وسكان يتميزون بالذكاء والفطنة.
I know for a fact that he's poisoned his own people. He doesn't believe in the worth of each individual. We must do everything we possibly can to stop the terror. Now watch this drive.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Pascal. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMD. A million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free.
Oh. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 5, the last session of our before last module. Congratulations for making it this far. Yes. So this module is the agents of counter-revolution, and today's class is on imperialism and hybrid warfare. And we're going to continue our study of counter-revolution and the methods that our enemies use to repress and disorganize us, specifically looking at US imperialism and the strategies and tactics it employs for global domination. So today we're joined by Comrade Layan Fuleihan, the Director of Education here at People's Forum. And we're also going to be joined online by Mika, a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And they're going to unpack the toolbox for us of hybrid warfare, from the media machine that we see working today to manufacture consent for genocide, to sanctions and political coups as we see in Venezuela. And they're going to focus on Washington's counter-revolutionary agenda to equip us with the necessary tools to confront the repression and to build revolution. So please give it up one more time, and yeah.
Viva la revolución. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is great to see all of you again. It is also quite... Oh, there's an echo? Okay. It is very significant, I think, that we are now completing the 5th week of this course in the context that we're in right now. And if you're in the room, you can see Mika now. She's on the screens. I'm really excited to be doing this class with our comrade Mika, who is an organizer, researcher with Tricontinental, for many years based on the African continent, organizing with the Pan-Africanism Today, coordination of Pan-Africanist and revolutionary movements across the continent. And what we're going to do today is really open up the beginning of what I hope will be a much longer and more in-depth study. Eugene actually started his class saying the same thing, and I think that's important because we need actually more than just a couple of sessions to really know our enemy. We started off this class with the assertion that we are studying here together, not just to study, but to actually become revolutionaries, to wage a revolutionary struggle, and to actually make a revolution happen. And we're not just saying that just to say it. We're saying it because we mean it. And anything that you fight, you have to know what you're fighting. And so the study of imperialism is something that takes much study. It takes struggle. It takes an understanding of the entire system that we're in. If you can tell so far in the course, we have talked about philosophy. We've talked about theory. We've talked about political economy. We were even crunching numbers on the board for a little bit. We've gone into a deep dive onto history. We've debated contemporary politics. We've talked about culture. We've touched on all spheres of human life. And that's not by accident. Of course, if we're going to make a revolution, we're going to have to wage revolution in all spheres of human life. And for our enemy, if they want to stop us, they will also be trying to stop us in all spheres of human life. And so preparing for this class, I think maybe Mika can agree or disagree with me, but I think maybe will agree with me. It's actually quite overwhelming because how do you actually pinpoint some of the most important and significant elements of imperialism to deliver in a 2-hour session? Because once you start opening the box of imperialism, you start seeing its impact in every part of lived experience of human society across the world. So we're going to do our best. We're going to at least start to what we hope to do is to define imperialism, so we're able to understand what it is, understand it also not just as a policy, but as the structuring stage of the world that we live in today. We already studied in the first module the way that capitalism develops and expands. Or raise your hand if you were with us in the first week, even if it was virtual. Oh, wow, the room is full. Okay, amazing. So you remember that capitalism needs a down payment to come into existence, right? And if you are a good capitalist in today's world, you know that you need more and more down payments to continue expanding, right? And we know that that came through violence, through theft, through force. But we need to understand how that is actually acting today and the complexity with which it is acting. We started the class off with 2 videos. One was a song about the IMF, if you caught the subtitles. The other was a short video reminding us of the lie that caused 1 million deaths, the lie of the weapons of mass destruction that basically laid the groundwork and marked the initiative of the US invasion of Iraq. And we chose those videos to ground us in exactly what we're talking about. If you were born in the last 30 years and you were born in the United States, you have never lived in a society that has not been in war. But we don't necessarily feel like we're in war every day when we go about our daily life. So we have to understand the way in which imperialism wages war. It's not necessarily exactly looking like the shock and awe of Bush's dropping of bombs on Iraq, or what it looked like when the U.S. was waging war against Vietnam. It's developed, it's more complex, it's more diverse, it has many different tools, but all the same, it is still a context of endless war. And so we want to understand what are the different tools, what are the different weapons, what exactly it is doing and why, so that we can better be able to diagnose it, struggle against it, fight against it, and like we said in the beginning and then we've been saying every week, and that we will continue saying once we finish this course, we are doing this because we know that we actually can win and that we will do it together. We just need to be able to have the tools that we need, both knowledge and organizational tools, to be able to wage the struggle. So let's get into it. I'm going to pass it first to Mika to bring us into the beginning of our definition of imperialism, and we will go from there.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones. Really excited for this class, and I'm very, very happy, and I guess we're a little bit astonished of how many people are in the Zoom room who are attending this class. So I really commend you all on taking this journey of like learning and unlearning. So I'm gonna start with the slides. Everyone can hear me okay, right?
Can hear you on person.
David, can you? There we go. All right, so before I hand back to Layan, I'm gonna talk a little bit about imperialism. And I just wanted to hear, maybe in the chat or maybe somebody in the room, what kind of, when you hear about imperialism, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Maybe you can share a few words in the chat, or if there are any hands in the room, maybe 1 or 2 people could say something. Empire, the US, I see in the chat. Divide and conquer, war crimes, controlling resources.
I was just going to say the US and Britain.
The US and Britain. Oh, I even see China in the chat. We'll talk about that later. Anyone else in the room?
Never-ending expansion.
Never-ending expansion. And I see highest stage of capitalism, white supremacy, war for profit, dividing up Africa, breaking up of Africa. Okay, so I think we have like, in general, we all have a sense of what it is, what its characteristics may be. But importantly, that we'll talk a little bit about Lenin's definition, Vladimir Lenin, the Russian revolutionary or the Soviet revolutionary, is that external conquest and colonialism have existed in longer periods of time, and conquest itself has existed for over 5,000 years. But imperialism, as Lenin and others understand it, is more specific. And as somebody said in the chat, it's part of the late stage of capitalism. So you've talked about capitalism, and now we're going into the later phase of it. And later I'll talk about, we have this nifty text from Tricon called Hyper-imperialism, where we've tried to make an intervention. We published it in January this year, where we're saying actually we're not just in the late stage of capitalism, but there's a very particular phase we're in right now that has very unique characteristics that are important to analyze. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. You can go to the first slide, but this is the general definition. And maybe somebody in the chat maybe wants to, in the chat in the Zoom room, maybe wants to read it. Are there any hands in the Zoom room? I see Josie.
Sure. Capitalism only became capitalist imperialism at a definite and very high stage of its development. Economically, the main thing in this process is the displacement of capitalist free competition by capitalist monopoly. If it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. V.I. Lenin.
And thank you. What do we understand by a monopoly? Anyone? If anyone can give a quick definition.
Anyone on Zoom?
I see one person maintaining power, one entity controls the market, private dictatorship, fewer owners, control the majority of the assets. Great. So basically, at this stage of capitalism, which begins to develop towards the end of the 19th century, but basically in the beginning of the 20th century, really becomes more fully fledged. It's the stage in which we don't now, as you guys had learned before, it's not just different firms or groups competing against each other, and it's almost a quote unquote equal playing field. We know that's not the case because of colonialism, but in the West, there's basically an even playing field. And what we see at this stage, this new transformation, is we have fewer and fewer controlling more and more and having almost near total ownership in various sectors and various industries and various resources. Next slide. Importantly, Lenin identifies 5 key aspects or key features of imperialism or of monopoly capitalism at this stage. The first is the concentration of capital and production, which essentially means that at this stage, large corporations, financial institutions essentially become the most dominant feature in our economies. And there's a concentration of the production and capital in fewer and fewer hands, as people have raised. And they basically become the decisive force in economic life. Then the second is finance capital. That we see this merging. You guys maybe went through the Industrial Revolution and things like that. We now see a merging of industrial capital with banking capital. So the industrialists are the employers, but the controllers are the bankers, the financiers. And this creates what Lenin calls finance capital, or some sort of form of a financial oligarchy. And this combination basically allows financial institutions to exert significant control over not only the economy, but of the governments. And that's why I think we played the song talking about the IMF. As Lion said, imperialism is the foundational structure that we inherit today. And as many of you know, finance then ends up dictating how we organize society, who gets to have what. The third important one is that we no longer have an export of goods where we're actually, exporting commodities, and also exporting commodities mostly for consumption in the Western colonial empires and the homelands, or as you say. But we start to see an export of capital, where capitalists are now actually sending capital across the world. And by sending capital across the world and moving capital across the world, we see that not only the value now has changed, where we don't have use value as a priority, but exchange value becomes increasingly more dominant. And then, as somebody said in the chat, part of this monopoly is that these cartels or trusts start to form. So we have a network of capitalists. We have a network of monopolies in various sectors, which again increases the concentration of who gets to control what and who has ownership over what. And most importantly, that has a huge effect and a huge impact on most of the global south and the borders that we have today is we move from colonial conquest or colonial expansion to division of the world amongst the big capitalists. So in the early phases, it was about what are the places we can loot, who are the human beings we can enslave, but now it's about what are the territories we can control, and in so doing, enable our hegemony in different countries, in different territories, in different regions. Importantly, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, I think, when I talk about hyper-imperialism, at this stage in history, it is competition amongst various imperialists. There are inter-imperialist wars. For example, World War I, World War II are those who dominate in the world arguing basically over which resources, peoples, and territories they can control. But that is not the stage in which we are right now. And I'm going to talk later about it, but we are no longer in the same time of Lenin. That was a very particular context. Right now, for us at least, and many leftists around the world, there is only one imperialism, and that is the US-led imperialist project. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is, because at this stage, through the use and monopolistic control of resources, the use of a huge ballooned, hyperinflated military, they're able to reinforce their control and guarantee their control. And I'll talk about it in more detail, but essentially, right now we can't say that there are many colonialisms or many imperialisms. There is but one, and the US is the one who is furthering that project and advancing it. If you go to the next slide, I want to briefly, but then I want to hand back to Layan, I want to briefly say, why did these monopolies, because I want to mention something about fixed capital shortly, is that why does monopoly capitalism develop? Essentially, the whole of human history, we're trying to advance, we're trying to increase the socialization of labor. So, Marx talks about this in Capital Volume 3, that the increasing socialization of labor, the interconnectedness or the increasing interconnectedness of human production is the basis for historical development of human society and the economy. So humanity began at a small scale. We were scattered in different areas, but as we developed through empire, through nation states, through conquest, the world became increasingly more interconnected. When it becomes increasingly more geographically interconnected, labor becomes more socialized, because we have then different component parts across the different parts of the world, across the value chain, in terms of producing key commodities. But also, the socialization of labor also happens over time, because each production cycle, you inherit what you had from before, and that creates a certain form of accumulation. And this accumulation through looting, through conquest, is what enabled countries like the UK to rise, countries like the US to rise, even Japan. Can you go to the next slide? Because I want to show a chart from one of my colleagues, John Ross, who is a British Marxist economist, who talks about, essentially, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the British basically were investing a lot in their GDP. And this is because they were able to get significant profit margins from the different commodities. But by reinvesting into their economies, they were able to, again, reinvest in the old production cycle and continue to increase their accumulation. And this is important because this is the accumulation that then creates this transformation from industrial capital to financial capital. Next one. And I wanted to show this because often when we're having some of these discussions, we talk about theory without necessarily the economic facts. And as you can see, that the US overtook the British to become the world's largest capitalist economy by the fact that they were investing in their GDP around 20% from about they started to increase, of course, much quicker because they had a lower industrial threshold. But by the early 1900s, they were investing much more into the economy. And I think this is important to share at this phase because often, just after the Berlin Conference in 1884, when we think about where does the US kind of pop up as a financial capitalist, is we don't see their role in the immediate colonial processes. Even though they participated in the Berlin Conference, we don't see them having an official colony at the same scale that we saw with the British, with the French, with the Spanish, with the Germans, etc. But at the stage in which they're seeing their real rise is during the phase in which they're also benefiting from the kind of colonial overhang. One more slide I think I have before I hand back to Liane. Oh, I just wanted to re-emphasize that even now, I think it's we get told in Africa a lot that like colonialism is over. You guys just need to figure out your path to development. You need to stop talking about the past. But essentially, slavery, conquest, colonization, the cheapening of African labor during the process of colonization that then we inherit in this neo-colonial phase we're in, that structure, that basis is how the West was able to rise. It was not out of ingenuity. It was not out of any kind of, superiority of any sort, as everyone here, I guess, knows. But it's important that they were able to gain that amount of financial capital to reinvest in themselves that then allows them to make that economic rise. And a lot of African countries can't do the same. We don't have the same industrial threshold. We aren't trying to, enslave anyone. So there's a certain catch-up that can never be done in the traditional sense because of this longer history of conquest and looting that essentially gave them the big leap into their rise in the 20th century. But I think, Liane, you wanted to talk now a little bit more. I want to come back to the stage of imperialism we're in right now. But I think importantly, Liane is going to contextualize a little bit the ways in which imperialism exerts itself in the world.
Thank you, Mika. Yes, I wanted to actually, building off of the definitions that Mika has given us, take a look at one of the contemporary weapons of imperialism that we have today and use that to kind of draw out some of the mechanisms that we might have. So in the past couple of weeks, we all saw the war on Venezuela take a new turn. Now, that's not the only imperialist war that's being waged right now, but it is developing in a new phase right before our eyes. So we've taken opportunity in this course to kind of analyze it and understand it because it actually is demonstrating a lot of the things that we're studying in real time. And in particular, what Mika was saying, let me backtrack a little bit. Where Mika left off, or one of the main points that we hope to develop further in the time we have together, is understanding the difference between Lenin's time when he proposed this theory of imperialism that has been very useful and continues to be very useful, and today. And the key difference being that we are now in a moment where the United States has complete hegemony over the global capitalist system. We're not in a moment where there's competing developing capitalist and imperialist powers that have competing hegemony over all those spheres that Lenin laid out. And the United States knows this and is working for it. We don't have time to go into it today, but if you have time to look into US military documents from the past 20, 30 years, you'll come across this term full spectrum dominance, which is something that when the US tells you what it's doing, let's actually take it into account. It's a military doctrine that has identified that in this new phase of global development, what the United States needs to do to protect its hegemony over the world is to create a new kind of military force that can actually be not only dominating in terms of military might, but also can be, as it says there, persuasive in peace, using ways to control and dominate economic life, cultural life, in order to maintain control and power over the rest of the world, whether it is actively at war or not. And to do that, it uses a combination of conventional war and unconventional war. And theorists in the past decade or so have come coined this term hybrid war as shorthand to help us understand this combination of tools that doesn't just look like what World War I and World War II looked like. It looks like using economic warfare, media warfare, cultural warfare, and all these different things. So to help us kind of understand this, we're developing a concept called hybrid war. Last week, you all saw the reflection questions, I'm hoping and assuming. One of the questions was asking you to think about the ways in which Venezuela is being attacked by the United States, and to try to draw out all the different ways that the United States is trying to kind of undermine Venezuela's project. Does anyone have some of the examples on the top of their mind? Sanctions? Sanctions, yep. Propaganda?
All this idea that Maduro is in a dictatorship state, that is a communist. So if you always have like a left agenda in America, they will say like, oh, we will end up like Cuba or Venezuela, and no, all this.
Okay, so sanctions, propaganda, false labels. Anything else? WhatsApp? Social media? Is there anything on the Zoom?
Okay.
Maybe Mika can read for us on the Zoom. Actually, Mika.
Or I see in NED, inciting violence, technological feudalism, co-opting classes, funding opposition groups, fascist thugs, cyber attacks.
Great. Okay, so we're going to take a look at one of these contemporary modern weapons, which happens to be an article from the New York Times. There was a group of comrades that just paid the New York Times a visit just before class to remind them that we know who they are and what they're doing. And there's a lot of research that's been done into the ways in which the New York Times has used its platform as the most reliable, most sophisticated, most unbiased and reliable, modern newspaper in ways to help U.S. imperialist projects. So if you look up any article about Venezuela on the New York Times, you'll see a lot of the same refrain. If you look at the top, actually, it's like the online page. These are the categories. The categories are, Maduro was declared winner. Okay, while Obama was elected, right? But Maduro was declared winner. U.S. recognizes Gonzalez, the one who wasn't declared or elected. So these are the categories, comrades. These aren't actually titles these are the categories in which you can find many articles. Okay, next one. This is the one we're going to look at. How could Maduro's reign end? How can we make it end, guys? Like, that's actually the category on the New York Times. Okay, so the top article that I found recently under that category is, how do you topple a strongman? This is an article in the New York Times asking the question and then proposing an answer of how to topple Maduro. So I want to actually read you parts of the article because it is actually very illuminating in a sense, because part of the reason why they're asking this question is like, well, why is it not working? We're trying all the things that should be working, but it's not working. So, okay. So they say, after another dubious election victory, Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, appears firmly in power. The only real potential threat, history shows, they're doing like us, they're learning from history, may come if his own security forces betray him. Okay, interesting. So, okay, I'm going to skim. Venezuela is another dark moment, they say. Okay. Nicolás Maduro, the authoritarian leader who has been in power since 2013, has declared himself the winner of another election. Okay, we're not going to go into this because we've already spent now class last week on why this is totally propaganda and the machinations behind this phrase. And if you want more detail, we have the recording from last night's session. But let's keep going. They say, is all hope for democracy in Venezuela lost? Opposition leaders are trying to push forward, and the United States has recognized their candidate as the winner of Sunday's vote. Now, this article is from August 4. Since August 4, the United States has been backed into a corner, and in one of their recent press conferences said, oh, well, we don't officially recognize him, but we just don't recognize anybody yet. So they're kind of, scrambling to figure out what to do. But that's fine. They essentially did recognize him even before the election happened. We know that. I'm repeating what we already studied. And they say, Mr. Maduro does not President Maduro, Mr. Maduro does not appear to be close to giving up power. What exactly would that take? The answer, according to analysts, political scientists, and a review of history, largely depends on government security forces. Then they go on to interview someone who is an expert in authoritarianism. Her name is Erica France. And she says she's done this study. She says between 1950 and 2012, nearly 2/3 of the 473 authoritarian leaders who lost power were removed by government insiders, according to an analysis. Okay, so I went down a rabbit hole last night, and I tried to find what this data is. Because, okay, first of all, who are the 473 authoritarian leaders? But it's just too much. Anyway, so... yeah, I'm like, who is she talking about, actually? I would like to know exactly who she's talking about, because I would like to know who she's defining as authoritarian. How did they lose power? Who were they removed by? There's literally no subjects in this sentence. This is supposedly data from an expert. Okay, so I will spare you the details, but I went on a rabbit hole, found the article buried somewhere in which she makes this claim, which is supposedly a summary of data from a book about authoritarianism. And it's totally unclear. In fact, if anyone wants to take time to try to dig up exactly how she made this number, that would be super interesting for us. I can give you the references. She's citing a book, but it's totally buried. It's very unclear. No one knows who she's talking about, what she defines as authoritarian. It's just said. She's an expert. She knows about it. Okay. Now, we also know history. It's not only the property of the New York Times and the professors at Michigan State University and all the other universities. We also know it. We know that there's been lots of coups around the world, and that the United States has had a major hand in the majority of them. This is just Latin America, and this is just since 1945, I believe. And I don't actually think this is fully up to date. And we already have 56 U.S. military interventions in Latin America in basically the same time period that she's talking about. And I also encourage you to look into the history of this. We've done other sessions about this at TPF. We have other resources, but this is a very interesting history because it helps us see the ways in which the United States has developed a method for refusing to allow the sovereignty, in particular, of Latin America and the Caribbean, by any means necessary. And by a lot of times, like Erica said, by doing it from the inside, getting people, government insiders, finding some way to generate the conditions for a coup and a transfer from a sovereign government to one that would be beholden to the interests of the United States. Okay, so the article continues. You can look it up as well. It's kind of interesting and crazy. At one point, they even claim that community collectives are actually militias, and they are armed and they attack people from the opposition. All sorts of wild claims are being made, again, in the New York Times. And then she says, again, she's back being quoted again, and she says, she's talking about Venezuela, and this is the paragraph before says that Mr. Maduro's increasingly authoritarian time and power has outlasted many analysts' expectations. They're like, wait, why? Why can this authoritarian dictator still be here? And then she says, it checks all the boxes for a regime that should be vulnerable to overthrow. It should be easy to do this, guys, says the authoritarianism expert. Here's the boxes that need to be checked. major economic problems, difficulties with the legitimacy of the government, and a narrowing of the support base. Okay, these are the ingredients to overthrowing the government. And she says they're all there, so why isn't he gone? So, comrades, I'm showing you this article and reading this article not just for a laugh, because we all know in particular now after the genocide in Palestine has unfolded that the New York Times is a stenographer of US imperialism, not a truth-finding platform. But this is such an interesting article to me because it literally lays out the toolbox of hybrid war. It summarized it for us. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Economic difficulties. So if you go through the New York Times and you'll look about the poverty and the hardship that exists in Venezuela, someone can tell me the source of hardship and poverty and economic difficulty in Venezuela? Sanctions. Okay, we are a very educated group of people here that has not received our education from the New York Times because they do not mention sanctions at all, basically, like very little. So just to talk a little bit about what sanctions are, because I think we've referenced them a lot, but we haven't fully delved into how they work. And we're not going to necessarily do that yet, but at least get into it a little bit more detail. Can anyone tell me what a sanction is in a brief definition?
It's used through either like blocking trade routes or pressure from one's corporations to stop the flow of trade to a country that, you know, one decides to be punished.
Okay. Yes. Perfect definition. Basically, a sanction is blocking someone from doing an economic transaction from a state or some sort of international body. Now, the United States is by far, I'm just reading this, by far the most prolific sanctioning authority. This is data from April of this year. The United States outpaces every other country in the world by more than double in the amount of sanctions that it has on different actors across the world. Essentially, it's quite simple. Sanction is basically the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, shorthand is OFAC, just basically puts out an order and blacklists an individual or a company. Says nobody in the United States can do any exchange with this individual or this company. This can be issued through an executive order. This can be done through the State Department. Essentially, the Treasury Department with this office here just puts out the blacklist. So there's 15,373. I actually think that might be an underestimate. We'll have to check. That there's individuals or companies that are sanctioned across the world. That is known as a primary sanction. So any assets that any individual or company has that is under US jurisdiction, blocked. So if you're a sanctioned person and you have a bank account in the United States, you no longer can access it. If you are someone in the United States and you want to do trade with a company or exchange with a company that's sanctioned, you can't do that. When it comes to Venezuela, the number one kind of the sanctions that you hear about the most is sanctioning the Venezuelan state oil company. We talked about this last week, that what Chavez did, among many other things, was nationalize the wealth of oil resources that the people of Venezuela have on their territory. Started to take it out of the hands of private companies that were doing business with U.S. capitalist companies and made it a nationalized resource. And this is, of course, a huge threat to U.S. capitalism. It's much harder to make profit, etc. So in 2019, a huge wave of sanctions came through. Washington sanctioned the entire state-run oil company, basically blocking all trade of oil to and from Venezuela. Overnight, Caracas was blocked from shipping crude oil to the United States, which meant losing $11 billion a year in revenues overnight by that one sanction. They also lost Citgo, which was the entity that was able to do a lot of the trade of the oil. It was completely seized, and it was placed under the control of Juan Guaido, which was the declared president of the United States, declared randomly by the United States. After that, the Trump administration then sanctioned 13 more companies and 10 more individuals for their involvement in building something called the CLAP program, which is actually the food distribution program that goes through the Venezuelan people. So basically everyone that was involved in building the state-run food distribution program, which was meant to alleviate the impacts of sanctions on the people of Venezuela, were also sanctioned. So buying food, distributing food, getting the resources that you need, also blocked. Absolutely a huge impact on the Venezuelan economy and on the conditions of daily life. Okay, then there's something called secondary sanctions that is on top of it, which is that the United States can, it's complicated to get into how they do it, but they basically set up a system so that any other foreign entity that is also doing business with Venezuela is at risk of getting penalized by the United States, which then starts to rob Venezuela of its other business partners outside of the United States. It makes it even more complex to get any resources, to get any revenue, to be able to sustain the Venezuelan economy. It creates a huge, huge block on being able to reproduce daily life in Venezuela. Okay, so I just wanted to go backwards in time a little bit because this isn't new. It's something that has escalated quite a bit. If you look at this, it wasn't always like this, but today the Washington Post put out an interesting study, and that says that the United States actually has targeted 1/3 of all nations across the world. So 1/3 of all countries across the world are under U.S. sanctions in varying levels of impact and severity. But the story of sanctions really starts with Cuba. And this is called the Mallory Memorandum. I think there's a few comrades in the room that could tell me what the Mallory Memorandum is, or on the Zoom, especially if you have participated in a delegation to Cuba.
Hi, I don't, well, I guess it says when it came out, it's 1960, but I know generally what it says, which is that it lays out an agenda for essentially getting rid of Castro and his government through, I think I'm trying to remember the language, but basically like through economic sanctions that cause like widespread despair and hunger.
Perfect. That's a perfect definition of it. So 1960, what happened the year before? The Cuban Revolution. Okay, great. So not even a year later, 1960. This is a classified document that only recently was declassified that we could read. And it's very simple definition of the U.S. approach to countries that are demanding their own sovereignty. Let's actually read it together, if you don't mind. So the subject here is the decline and fall of Castro. So basically the same title as the New York Times article that we were just looking at. How do you topple a strongman? Okay, they say, interesting salient considerations respecting the life of President Government of Cuba are, 1, the majority of Cubans support Castro. The majority of Cubans support Castro. 2, there is no effective political opposition. Okay, so far we're actually still describing Venezuela. The majority of Venezuelans support the socialist project. The opposition is certainly not very effective. They're not running people that are qualified to be elected. Okay, 3, Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. Okay, 4, communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. 5, militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. Okay, So they are identifying in 1960, not even 1 year after the revolution, that this has the potential to be a very influential communist revolution, and to oppose it militantly inside or outside Cuba would actually cause people to react in defense of the revolution, which would backfire. So they're relatively smart, they know that. 6, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So their proposal here is that the only way to overthrow Fidel Castro and the potential of communism in so-called United States backyard is to alienate Fidel Castro by creating a context of economic dissatisfaction. So, I won't read all the rest of it, but basically this is a proposal, and they say to carry this out, the principal item in our economic quiver would be flexible authority in sugar legislation. This needs to be sought urgently. What was the #1 export of the Cuban economy in 1960? So they are basically saying no more Cuban sugar. We're not going to do trade with Cuban sugar. We're not going to buy Cuban sugar. We're not going to give any income to the Cuban people. So this is to put sanctions into context. You all remember when just 2 years ago, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly every news outlet was clamoring at the White House press conferences saying, you need to put more sanctions, more sanctions, more sanctions. Let's have more sanctions. Let's actually look one more time at what sanctions actually do. What does it look like in real life? That's the United States, that's Cuba, in case you don't know. It's not to size, but just so you could see. Okay. Because the United States will say, and that's what they said during the 2 years ago, that sanctions are a benevolent option. They're the non-military option. It's targeting individuals. It's targeting dictators. It's something that is the nice thing. We're a nice imperialist country now. We don't just bomb people all the time. It's something that we can do to convince people to follow the new world order, the US world order. The Mallory Memorandum exposes it as a tool of starvation, of coercion. But let's look at how it actually works. And I'm going to use Cuba as an example, because Cuba has the most amount of sanctions for the longest amount of time, since 1960, since the Mallory Memorandum. Okay, so basically, the basic one. If you want to do trade with Cuba, or you want to buy from Cuba, or you want to sell to Cuba, blocked. There's a series of sanctions that stop you from being able to do that. Okay, so what about this? What if some other person wants to do business with Cuba and they have to go through some sort of broker that has an office, has one of their offices in the United States? Just one of them, maybe. Or you want to sell phones, but one of the plastic parts is made in a US company. No, you can't do that. Okay, let's say you want to do a financial transaction. And what's the currency of the global economy? Okay, let's say you want to do any financial transaction in US dollars. Guess. Why is it not going? No, you can't. Okay, well, let's say you just want to go to the beach. Cuba has great beaches. It's in the Caribbean. It's like 2 seconds away from Florida. Can you guess? No. In fact, every hotel, basically, in Havana is on a sanction list. It's such a detailed list of sanctions that you literally cannot do anything. Okay, what if you're out in the seas, a ship is carrying things from one part of the ocean to another and wants to stop in Cuba and not even do any economic transaction, just stop for a second. Sure, you can stop, but you can't then go to the United States for a significant period of time. I forget the exact number of months. If you've been to Cuba, if you've even docked in Cuba, not that if you've done trade with Cuba, if you've even docked with Cuba, those are those secondary sanctions, you cannot dock at the United States. You can't do trade with the United States. So it not only blocks, look at all the exits, it not only blocks any import or export or transaction or trade with Cuba, but it blocks other forces that are not related to the United States, companies or government or population in any way, from being able to do trade with the United States if they do anything at all with Cuba, which is 10 years for the ships? Okay, we have a proposal that it's 10 years. Okay, I thought it was a matter of months, but it's 6 months. Thank you. Okay, 6 months. But in this economy dominated by the United States, it's all good. We're learning together. In this economy dominated by the United States, 6 months of not being able to interact with the United States is a big deal. That will lose you a lot of profit. You may actually no longer be able to survive. Remember that all international financial transactions are done in US dollar. So essentially, sanctions are not just sanctions. When it comes to the highest sanctioned countries like Cuba, now Venezuela, the others are Iran and North Korea, it's essentially a blockade, an embargo. You're completely isolated. In the case of Venezuela, it's an island. It's completely isolated. That's why you see those very cool cars that are from the 1950s, not because everyone loves that style of car. And of course, it represents the ingenuity of people who resist US domination, but because there's no way to get parts to have updated and modern cars. Imagine then also what that does to medicine, to food, to technology, to all the other things that we need to survive. Okay. How do I go to the... Okay, great. Does everyone feel like they understand sanctions? Yeah? Okay. Then we have these other ones. Difficulties with establishing legitimacy. We don't have to spend so much time on this because we've studied it in the past classes. It's going to be really hard for Venezuela to insist to the United States that yes, Venezuela has free and fair elections, if the United States and all of its media outlets for weeks in advance were already saying that it wouldn't be free and fair. Creating a situation in which the United States, again, the global hegemon, is saying no matter what you do, it won't be legitimate. In fact, it's so illegitimate that we're going to appoint your next president, which they did with Guaido, in which they were indicating they were going to try to do this time, but they kind of started to back down. They also seized the Venezuelan embassy in the United States. So in 2019, it's chained, locked and chained. It's been seized. So Venezuelan migrants living in the United States can't have any consular activities here. There's no formal representative here. Basically blocking Venezuela from having the ability to interact politically with the US or in any official capacity in the United States. And then the narrowing of the support base, which we saw that they wanted to do with the process of creating economic dissatisfaction, but also by creating articles like the one we just read. How to topple the strong man. I don't know why I can't go to the next slide. Basically saying, just creating a situation in which every media outlet, every State Department official, and not only in the US, but getting a lot of agreement with this in Europe and other places, that everyone is in agreement without question that Venezuela is under a dictatorship or is under authoritarian rule. This is a great map. This is done by the Council on Foreign Relations. They have a political education website that you can take a look at where they explain the world for you. And they have a lot of, you should actually browse through it. It's very interesting. And they have a series of maps to help us understand what is free and democratic in the world and what isn't. So this is the Global Democracy Index. The darker color is more democratic. The lighter color is more authoritarian. So this is the world according to the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. You can see Canada is darker than the United States, so they have some capacity for self-reflection. Basically, Africa is completely authoritarian, according to them. China, Russia don't even try. But you can see, like here, Cuba, Venezuela, pale, super pale. But if we were going to make that map, Yeah, look here. The only dark one in the Middle East region is Israel. They even actually took out the West Bank. If you look closely, the West Bank is carved out and it's pale. I mean, this is literally apartheid state. This is literally an apartheid state. If we were going to make this map, don't have to tell you, it would look a lot different. But this is like the authority on the world for the United States. They've created this situation where if you are going through your daily life, how many of us have gone through our daily life, and if we didn't start to ask questions and seek out people that had different answers, would we maybe come to the same conclusions? If the entire infrastructure around you is creating a situation in which this is the understood reality. Okay, I think I'm taking up too much time. I apologize, Mika. I'm going to wrap up. But I wanted to just end on this. This is from the recent Wall Street Journal expose on sanctions. Basically, over the past couple of years, a variety of different voices have all been saying, well, guys, it's not working. Sanctions are not working the way we wanted it to. And that's, again, going back to the original article. Why is it that even though all the ingredients are there, economic dissatisfaction, even despair, no political legitimacy, completely trying to narrow the support base, making sure that people don't have an idea of the reality on the ground, why is it not working? And it's not only not working, it's one of the biggest used tools of the US government. If we go to another part of the world that maybe we all are familiar with, Palestine, it's been, if you remember in October, if you remember how the media was talking about the Israel-Hamas war, in quotes, in October, they were saying maybe it will be over in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's the combined military weight of the United States and Israel, the most strong military powers in the world, have been now, 10 months later, not able to win. So imperialism is even without sanctions. Now we're in the full part of conventional warfare. These are all headlines from Foreign Affairs, just the front page. I just screenshotted them, all the ones that have to do with the Arab region. Okay, why Israel escalates. Risky assassinations are a desperate bid to restore deterrence. Desperate bid to restore deterrence. Waging the wrong war in Yemen. The limits of US and Saudi security deal. Don't expect Riyadh to take Washington's side against China and Russia. Is it possible to govern Gaza? America isn't ready for the wars of the future. America is losing the Arab world. Imperialism is conscious of the fact that the more it develops, the more it creates contradictions for itself. And if you've been following the news recently, you know that the US and Israel are quite nervous right now because after their brazen assassination of the lead negotiator on the side of the Palestinians, so supposedly they're trying to reach a ceasefire deal, so sure, they're going to assassinate the lead negotiator of the other side. Now that everyone is quite nervous about possible regional war. I don't want to be trite about it because there's one way that we could look at it and be kind of sarcastic because it is kind of ridiculous. The United States and Israel have been escalating, and now all of their media is like, we're really scared about regional war. Like, this is really bad. And if you look at the media about kind of the diplomatic back channels and the activity of the State Department right now, they are 100% focused on trying to, quote, convince Iran and convince the Iranian proxies, as they call them, to not escalate. It would have probably been better if they themselves did not escalate in the first place. But, okay, putting that aside, this is a sign of the stage of imperialism that we're in. We started class by saying that, recognizing that we are in a period of perpetual war. Raise your hand if you can think of a war that the United States has won in your lifetime. Okay, which wars? Grenada, okay. Okay, I'm seeing, yeah.
Someone said the war against my mental health.
The war, the war against my mental health. Okay, basically silence in the room, comrades. You know, usually when you're trying something and it doesn't work, you end up stop trying it, right? But the United States has not stopped trying it. In fact, it knew that it didn't want to get into regional war. We can talk more about it later. It knew it, but it still didn't do anything to stop Israel from escalating. And we could talk about that because there is no difference between, if Israel's doing something, it's with the United States, but it didn't do anything to put the brakes on it. Why is it in this day and age that the United States, despite never winning a military conflict and despite never winning an economic conflict, even over how many years of sanctions? Over 60 years of sanctions in Cuba, over decades and decades of sanctions have not broken the revolutionary processes in Cuba nor in Venezuela, have not broken North Korea. And Iran and Russia and every other sanctioned country in the world is still managing to survive. In fact, more countries are now kind of shaky about their relationship with the United States, even Saudi Arabia. So if it's not working, why is it still the case that it's still perpetual war and over 15,000 sanctions? It's not enough to say that the imperialism is stupid or that it's dying or that it's weak, because we know that that's actually not the case. The United States has the biggest amount of resources. It is the wealthiest country on the world still by far. Mika will go into this. Still the strongest military power in the world. And so it can feel somewhat irrational. But instead of kind of just saying, well, that, it's irrational, it doesn't make sense, it's not going to last forever, our task is slightly different. We have to understand the nature of the system that creates the moment that we're in right now, and that creates a reality in which it still is the agenda of imperialism to wage war for global domination, for full spectrum dominance, even if it's taking a lot of costs. We're in a complex and difficult to understand moment, but nothing's too difficult to us because we have organization and we have the science of Marxism. We're able to analyze the beast that's in front of us. But it's different than any kind of phase of imperialism that's come before us. So it's a large task, and for that, I'm going to pass it to Mika.
So I'm gonna, I might skip through some slides, David, so when I say next, just hop on over. But Lan just gave a little introduction, essentially.
Just 1 second, Mika. Let's get your volume up quickly. And comrades, you can turn your chairs. They have wheels, so you can see Mika better. Okay. Go ahead.
All right, great. So, as Layan said, we're living in a moment in history that hasn't been seen in 100 years. There is a qualitative shift that's been occurring for many decades, but is, or a quantitative shift that is now showing the qualitative aspects change. And as I said before, even though various tendencies of imperialism from the phase of Lenin continue to exist today and actually have accelerated over the decades, if we're talking about the concentration of wealth in a few monopolies, we know, you guys know this, these figures of the top 1% in the US own more collective wealth than the bottom 90%. The 22 richest men in the world have more collective wealth than all 325 million African women. You know that, I think it's like the top 10 Fortune 500 companies, they control 20% of the US economy, which is an increase from previous years, etc. But this is not imperialism of the period in which Lenin was describing it. And it's shifted in various stages from World War I to the post-94 period in which the US starts to see its ascendancy, towards the 80s or so, when it seems like there is no hope. And you guys had a Fukuyama moment, I think, earlier, where it seemed like the end of history was on the horizon, according to those neoliberal pundits. But we've now seen, and I'm going to talk about it in relation also to China, since I saw a lot of questions about China, is that with the rise of China and with other shifts in the control of productive forces across the world, a new economic base is kind of being brought into reality, and that economic base has possibilities for the global south. It might not be always a socialist possibility, but has possibilities to challenge the US. But we started this study last year because we've sensed that there was a missing element in the left around how we read the current conjuncture. And this is the document that well, you can see there, but I have it physically here, that myself and many other socialist thinkers and activists around the world contributed to creating. And we call this hyper-imperialism a dangerous, decadent new stage. So one is hyper. What are some of the connotations of hyper? It's that it's extreme, it's excessive, it is over and above its normal behavior. Then two of the elements that we see, especially in the US, and Lan has shown it, especially with that last image in terms of the wars across the world, is that it's an extremely dangerous phase we're in. And I'm going to give a few numbers. And that the danger is also combined with the fact that it's in a decadent phase. So what does decadent mean? It's a state of decline, of deterioration that is often, associated with excessive indulgence. That overindulgence shows the level of loss of vitality. And this decadence combined with the dangerous element is what is something that we in the left need to have, I think, a concrete understanding about, because as we saw, I think Palestine is pretty much the most succinct example of this dangerous decadency, because it wields a huge military might, and it does so without any form of accountability. And in the text, we talk about how, this stage of imperialism is not set or certain, but it is in process right now. And you feel it because of the way in which a lot of proxy wars are being fought around the world in order for the US to retain hegemony in the world, because it's losing hegemony in production and in various areas of technology, in various areas of finance that I'll raise in some detail. But initially, the reason we came to thinking about how do we understand this current conjuncture is because, if you go to the next slide, a colleague of ours, or one of my colleagues and John Bellamy Foster, Gisela Cernadas and John Bellamy Foster, they were looking at US military spending because, the often cited number comes from SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. And they generally estimate the US military spending, this is 2022 numbers, they estimated it around 800 billion. But on further analysis, and this is just by going through the US, the US Bureau of Figures, just by going very, very closely looking at different spending, including budgets that are often not counted, like, for example, the US veterans budget isn't included in SIPRI's calculation. But basically, by going through it, what they found was that US military spending in 2022 was almost double what not only the US reports as its spending, but also of institutes like SIPRI. And if we look at their combined access, so US military spending at 1.53 trillion, the rest of NATO and non-NATO US military allies, so let's say, Japan and the Philippines, the US military basically, or the US-led military bloc basically spends almost 75% of military spending. Somebody raised in the chat, and I'll continue to circle around this, the question of China. There's often this depiction that China is directly like a threat that is fighting actively with the US, like two elephants locking horns. But that is not true, because it's got a gargantuan difference that China spends 10% of world military spending compared to the almost 75% of military spending, world military spending that the US's led bloc actually has. If you go to the next slide, if you put it in context, look at the US here. This is far outpacing anyone. If you combined China's, you have to go 6 times or so in order to get the same amount of military spending, and Russia's as well is much, much, much less. If you go to the next slide, in per capita terms, it's even more stunning, because basically, in terms of the world average, the US spends 12.6 times more than any country, than the average spending of any country. And of course, Israel follows very closely at 77.2%. You can't match it with any other kind of threat to the US Russia, China, India are far below that in terms of spending. So it's just to give a sense of this overinflated spending that goes into it. But why is there this overinflated spending? Is because hegemony is historically lost in three stages: in production, in finance, and military. The US has essentially lost, and I'll show you the figures soon, essentially lost hegemony in production, though it has, areas like technological areas and areas related to the military where it's still managing a little bit. But it also is seeing, and this is with the rise of China, it is seeing a loss in terms of financial hegemony, and it's being challenged in still in the early stages, but we're seeing this through these creations of things like BRICS, creation of new financial mechanisms, whether it's in China or Russia, even in Gulf states, but basically global South countries seeking other financial alternatives precisely because of what Lion talked about with sanctions, is that if you want to survive and develop an alternative development for your country, your region, if you're within the US dominated financial systems, you will be blocked. And so there are small alternatives that are in their nascent phase, but are nonetheless thinking about how to challenge this dominance of the US. And even though the economic and political aspect of its decline are accelerating, it by no means we can't understate its military power, as we've seen. And it retains military domination across the world. And it's creating, how can I put this? Basically, as we're seeing in Gaza, as we're seeing in Ukraine, as we're seeing actually in the South China Sea and with the Philippines, with Japan and Korea, the US has deluded itself to think that it can overcome its economic limitations through military means. Because it can't subordinate the whole world financially, it has to subordinate it militarily. And that is why it's so important to understand that this is not a China versus US story. This is the US versus the world. And China happens to be, in material terms, an actual challenger that is important for us to think about how we ally with and how we interact with and engage with. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. You can go to the next slide. I just want to briefly just show that, as you know, I periodically, so I study China-Africa relations. And like every 2 years, there's some announcement that comes out from AFRICOM saying like, China is trying to build a new base, a hidden base here, or we heard about the hidden base or China spy base in Cuba. There are these periodic stories that come up. The only foreign base that China has in Africa is in the Horn of Africa, and that was actually a decision made by the UN Security Council in an effort to tackle piracy. So the UN asked for it, and China said that they could provide that basis. And so it has a very different, social and economic connotation compared to, as you see right now, the 902, and these are known because we often know there are some unknowns, but the 902 foreign military bases that exist across the world. Two things I'll say about that, because not all bases are equal. Some are tiny, some can be like an office of 2 people. There's one in Brazil that is actually in scale minor, but the map kind of suggests, because it's all colored in Brazil, as you can see, it makes it look like it's more inflated. So I just want to put that caveat out there, that not all bases are equal. But nonetheless, you can see just how dominant the US is in the world, its military footprint. And don't you think it's interesting how you can see the darkness and the shape of it is encircling China, is encircling Eurasia, is basically pushing that flank. And that's part of why we have the situation in Ukraine, is because NATO broke on their agreement that they would not move 1 inch further and have consistently increased their presence in that region. And as you can see, Africa is playing an interesting kind of buffer zone that directly has a bird's eye view of what's happening in Eurasia. And by the way, more than 2/3 in terms of quantity, more than 2/3 of the bases are concentrated in 2 countries that I think is important. One is in Germany, and the second is in Japan. And they have, I can't remember the specific number, but they have huge amounts of bases because who are they? They were the 2 defeated countries after the Second World War. And part of the agreement was that they had to subordinate their sovereignty through the presence of these vast military bases. Next slide. And the other point I just want to briefly make is in 2022 alone, these were what we call like the global north, and I'm going to speak about who we consider the global north. These are the global north military deployments, quote unquote deployments, in the global south just in 2022 alone. And we had the highest amount in Mali, there were 31, in Iraq, there were 30, in Lebanon, there were 18, in the Central African Republic, 13, South Sudan, 13. But essentially, it's a highly active organization, a highly active, and I say highly active in the sense that bases are not static. They're constantly redeploying and constantly moving in order to guarantee their presence in the region. Next slide. And I think this is important because this is going to take us back to this question of one imperialism versus many imperialisms. Is in this particular moment, this was a part of a statement in January of last year between the head of the European Council, the head of the European Union, and Jens Stoltenberg, the guy in the middle, Mr. NATO himself, the General Secretary of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in their statement, they said this: "We will further mobilize the combined set of instruments at our disposal, be they political, economic, or military, to pursue our common objectives to the benefit of our 1 billion citizens." So we are not the ones who are dividing the world. It is very clear whose interests they care for. They care for their 1 billion population, and they're willing to use any means necessary in order to guarantee those interests. So right now, I think the line has been drawn in the sand ever since Ukraine. The line has been drawn in the sand that Europe and America, basically the global north, will only operate in their so-called own interests, even if in the long term it's against their interests, as we'll discuss. Can you go to the next one? Oh, the people in the picture is the head of the European Council. I forget his name. The middle guy is Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, and what's her name? I forget, but the head of the European Union is the woman. I loathe them more than any people in the world. But the next thing I just want to raise briefly, and I know it's not a lot of time to talk about it right now, but when we were writing this, Van Leyden. Van Leyden is the name of the woman. But whilst we were creating this document, we would send it to comrades all over the world to review, to discuss, to debate. It's a living document that we hope to have another iteration next year with updated numbers and updated conceptual thinking around it. But one of the interventions that was actually made by a US comrade was that it's really important to show that the US has a very clear geostrategic view of the world. They want to control Eurasia, they want to overthrow socialist states, and in so doing, they need to denuclearize and dismember all other potential adversaries. So the question of China, the question of Russia, the question of Iran, all of these are threats to them because A, they possess nuclear capacity or near nuclear capacity. But in the case of China, they possess an economic threat because they're displacing the US in terms of their GDP and their advances in various areas of life. But it's important to see it in this view because right now we don't have the luxury of saying, because of certain internal domestic policies, we can never tactically ally with different countries and different regional leaders or regional projects. Because right now, it's the US who is wanting to increase and continues to increase its attempts to threaten China by increasingly showing that we could use nuclear warfare. And if we let it get to that stage, we won't have an earth to live on to fight with our domestic bourgeoisie, etc. So right now we are also in a critical phase, and it's been hard for many of us who are used to fighting our national bourgeoisies and our elites to also have to think about the bigger picture, that if China was to be destroyed, the world would roll back 100 years. If we allow for any kind of nuclear warfare to happen, and by the way, China doesn't defend, they only work defensively, they will never make the first strike. But if the US was to be mistaken enough to launch a nuclear war, we wouldn't have a world in which we could exist on. And so it's important for us to see, as Lenin put it, we always have to see the long-term interests of the working class as a whole, and not our short-term national interests, even though we have to fight on both fronts. Then briefly, if you can go to the next one, and I don't want to spend too much time, but there are some points I really do want to make, is we now, through discussion and debate and consultation, we decided we needed to think about how do we group the world? How do we organize the world? Who is aligned to who and for what reasons? And the term global north, global south, for the last 10 years or so has been in fashion, but it's lacked a bit of precision in terms of what is the material basis for making those kinds of blockings or groupings and blocks, and who are they? To us, the global north is a integrated political, military, and economic bloc. The US has managed to subordinate all political and economic interests of other European states. Those who think that Germany is still making independent decisions, if you just look at the DAX, the German stock exchange, most of it is foreign owned. Most of it is foreign owned. And so Europe doesn't have a project for itself. Your Scholz in Germany doesn't have a project, a national project for Germany. Your Macrons don't have, and as we saw in the elections, the people felt it clearly, these leaders do not have a project for humanity. Whilst others, like we see China brokering peace with Iran and the Saudis, we see China bringing the Palestinians together. Russia had brought the Palestinians together prior to that, saying, listen, y'all, you need to, get together, and of trying to advance moments for peace and movements for peace and processes for peace and unity within global South countries. And so, one, we looked at how do we understand the global North and understand that it is an integrated military bloc. But two, how can we better, even though it's in subjective terms to a certain extent, how can we understand the global South? What is the global South? Unfortunately, the global South is not integrated, is not united, is not sharing a political project that they actively work on. We do have common history in colonization. We do have common interests around pursuing national development, pursuing our sovereignty, giving dignity to our people. We do have those things. And we also see institutions or organizations like BRICS have come up that is looking to pursue certain economic common agendas. We see in terms of politics, we saw the group that Venezuela led in 2019, the creation of the group in defense of the UN Charter, which is a form of political resistance to, and a lot of the countries that are sanctioned by the US are in that grouping. But we see some nascent multilateral organizations that are coming from the global South, but they're still largely in the early stages, and they suffer from all the historical differences that have been created throughout history. I mean, I have a colleague who, works on BRICS a lot and is constantly telling us about how India consistently blocks very important processes from being unleashed because there are political differences. So there's a lot of political differences, but we need to figure out what is the common plan here, because we really don't have a choice at this stage in history. And I want to briefly, if you can go into it, maybe you can, next slide. Next slide, the ring one. We also thought it's important for people to think about, there's of course layers of allegiance. And we created this image to think about who's closest to the US, who's most aligned to the US, and for what reasons. The first reason, and the most important reason, was that those who are closest to the US are what we call the Five Eyes plus Israel. The Five Eyes was created just after World War II, where essentially it was a form of intelligence sharing. So these are the countries, the UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, and New Zealand, that are the closest in terms of intelligence, and therefore in terms of military, and therefore in terms of foreign policy and how they exchange information. Notice that UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, New Zealand, or apart from the UK, are all white settler projects. So it's not a coincidence, a coinky dink, that those who are closest allies to the US are those who come out of white settler projects and from historically dispossessing people from other parts of the world. Then we have the second ring, which is your Germanys and Frances. So those who are close and are part of the what we call the Nine Eyes, that also share intelligence, but not as close as the Five Eyes. Then we have the 14 Eyes, which includes some of the other countries in the third ring. And those, again, are close, but still aren't as trusted as the inner core. And then we have the other Eastern European countries, most of them in the outer ring, who aren't by any means, we know from history, many of them were part of the Soviet Union, but who have essentially been totally subordinated, aside from Belarus and Russia, totally been subordinated to the US's agenda. Next. You guys can check out the study. It's on there in tricontinental.org or thetricontinental.org. But we importantly try to ground again this global north in this history of their shared history and common history of being active in the slave trade, colonizers, genociders, white settler states, divided Africa, awarded part of China to Japan during the 1919 Versailles Treaty, as well as were fascist powers in World War II, and the US is the only country to, of course, have used nuclear warfare. But this is the basis upon which the global north, which is led by the US, which is the imperialist, who subordinates all the rest of them, emerges out of. And go to the next slide. I wanted to use this quote also because she mentions China. This is Leila Khaled, a Palestinian revolutionary, and she, at an event we had last year in November or October, she had this to say when she was thinking about the global north. They are the heroes of terrorism, the imperialist force everywhere in the world, in Iraq, in Syria, and they're doing so because they're preparing to attack China. All of what they say about terrorism turns out to be about them. People have the right to resist with all means to it, including armed struggle. This is in the UN Charter. So they are the violators. They're the ones who are violating the rights of people for resistance because it's their right to restore their freedom. And I raise this because not only is she talking about the level of violence in which the US exerts itself in the world, but those who claim to be defenders of peace are the ones who continue to violate the world. And it's a very much us and them moment, more than we've seen since the post-colonial period, essentially. And the world is truly divided in these two different segments. And if you go to the next slide. Oh, just as I mentioned earlier, but I thought it's just useful to say that there are no more many imperialisms, because if you look at, these are two different studies, basically of the German stock exchange and the ownership. And it's a bit hard to see right now, but if we would look at the one on the right, the yellow, which is 52.1%, is foreign owned. Then there's 21% domestic ownership. And then there's kind of a 30-something percent, what is it? It's 16% is unassigned, which is likely to be the US. It's really hard to do these kinds of studies because this information is not very publicly available. But we shared this because we wanted to be able to say that even countries like Germany, who have been considered, leading economies in the West and in the world, are totally subordinated to the US. Not only are they subordinated, but their industries are now out of date. I mean, Germany's industrial value added has declined from 9% to 6% in the last 18 years. The fact that the riches that come for Germany come from the invention of the combustion engine. So that was an important invention for their sector. But now with electric vehicles, they're becoming obsolete. And then they're being told by the US to not have any deals with China, and therefore allowing themselves to, again, subordinate any kind of autonomy that would actually benefit their people. And so that's why there aren't many imperialisms anymore. There's just the one led by the US and with all its subordinates below it. And by the way, in terms of, it's not quite hybrid warfare, but in terms of how the US continues to dominate the world, even in Europe, I had this statistic that around 1 in 5 of all private TV channels, excluding local TV, are US owned. So almost a quarter of private TV channels in Europe are US owned. And I don't think people get that sense when they think about Europe, because they think Europe has got its own independence because of the colonial period, but it's totally been subordinated. The fact that Germany supported sanctions against Russia and Ukraine, and when Israel started their war on Gaza on its 100th day, they'd already killed 23,000 Palestinians. Germany, with its history of violence in Namibia, and of course the domestic Holocaust against Jewish people, they still supported Israel, which they don't support Israel because of Israel, but they support Israel because of the US. So if you go to the next slide, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just want to say that the world is looking very different. And part of our study that I encourage you all to read, it's quite long, but I encourage you all to read, is that the world is divided. The US is heading this imperialist project. Not all hope is lost, precisely because the US is losing hegemony in production in production and finance, but it still has this huge military power and huge military capacity. But we see the decadence, the fact that there is a form of decline in the fact that it resolves political, economic, diplomatic issues only through military means, only through the threat of military violence. And therefore, part of our responsibility as activists, especially us in the global south, is that we, like in Africa, we needed infrastructure. China came and bought infrastructure. We needed certain financing. China bought financing. And for us, the emergence of China in Africa is extremely important, not because China, whatever you think of as politics, is some kind of benevolent, big brother helper, and doesn't come with various issues. There are many private companies, Chinese companies, that do not so good business or poor deals or whatever it is. But the fact is, with the rise of China, Africa finally has options. We can actually choose. We don't have to go to the IMF and beg. The rise of China means that we can exercise choice. And part of sovereignty and the goal for sovereignty is being able to choose your path to development. And China's rise has really opened that up for many countries in the global south. And I could talk about China, Africa all day long, but one thing I'll say is, I remember 2 years ago, there was a documentary called something, it was about Chinese companies basically treating workers in poor conditions and breaking various laws. When that came out, the Chinese government did their investigation. Well, wait, no, first one, they recalled those companies. They said, those companies, come home now. Then they did an investigation. Then they sanctioned those Chinese companies. China sanctioned their own companies, and people had to pay various what is it called? They had to fees. They were punished, basically. And in all my life, please somebody send me a link if you found it. In my whole life, I've never heard of the US government recalling a mining company for malpractices in foreign soil. I have never heard of that in my life. And so I can give many examples as to why I don't think China is a colonizer or an imperialist force. But on the very surface of it, its own behaviors are just qualitatively different from the US, and it doesn't show itself in its business deals and everything to want to subordinate other people for its own interests. There is one thing I wanted to show quick. If you can jump to, it's like the figure 41. Or before 41, global south versus global north share of GDP. Next. And I want to end with it. Next. Yes. So this is where there is an economic opportunity right now. So this is a chart of, if you look at the global south versus the global north, as we define it, what is their share of world GDP? By 2006, the global south overtook the global north in terms of their share of the world GDP, where right now it's around 60%, whilst the global north has 40%. And even if you take China out of this, minus China out of this, the global south still has a bigger share of the world GDP. And why do we share this, and why do we think about this, and why do I want to flag this, is that the economic base is shifting southward. There are material conditions that are shifting in ways in which that might allow the global south to pursue sovereignty and dignity. And that advance means this opportunity isn't guaranteed, but in terms of the actual economic basis, as you've seen it in the US, there's a huge decline that's happening, that if we don't take an opportunity, or if we don't seize the opportunity right now and try to create global south relations, people to people relations, even state to state relations, and understand that there's a bigger challenge here, then we're going to lose out on this historical moment. We must break any form of hegemony the US has in the US and outside of the US. And that involves sometimes making tactical alliances with peoples and countries that you don't necessarily agree with, that might not be socialist, that might not be revolutionary, but have an anti-imperialist stance. Because right now, the only true threat to humanity is the US and the US-led military bloc. I think I'll end there because I have so much more I can talk about, but then it's going to take us a bit out far from time, and we have 15 minutes left.
Thank you, Mika, so much.
Thank you, Mika, so much. I want to say a few things before we move into question and answer. But first, I just want to actually propose, and Mika, maybe you can give us a thumbs up if it's okay with you, that we extend 15 minutes just to make some more time for questions. Is that okay with everyone in the room?
Sure.
Yeah. Mika? Great. So I just want to wrap up a little bit because we covered a lot of ground, and at the same time, we only scratched the surface. And hopefully we drew some of the arc of where we need to study further and deeper. And I can't emphasize enough reading the hyper-imperialism text in its entirety. Like Mika said, it's a living document, it's a working document. Part of what it is to be a revolutionary means that you have sacrificed yourself to perpetual study for your entire life, because the more you study, the more you realize you don't know. And that's part of our task. But so glad that we have collective researchers who are able to produce documents like the hyper-imperialism document that can be updated, that can help us form a basis for being able to understand imperialism as it develops and shifts and changes in the region. And I wanted to just pose a few conclusions or summary as we end. You can go to, yeah, that's great. Just to bring us back to the basics as we've gone through this journey of looking at scratching the surface of hyper-imperialism and hybrid warfare, to remember why imperialism does what it does. We remember from the beginning that we need more resources, we need to expand markets for capitalism to continue to develop. When Lenin was writing and theorizing about imperialism, he actually wrote, you all possibly have seen his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capital. He wrote that as a polemic. Most of the things that Lenin wrote was a polemic. If you remember Brian Becker, he did a class on Lenin earlier, or at the end of last year, where he kind of went into this. But most of Lenin's writing was a polemic, including that text. And the polemic he was making there, in essence, was that imperialism is not a policy choice. It's actually a structure of capitalism itself in the moment in which he was writing. And like Mika said, and we repeated, in that moment, there were multiple competing imperialist powers, and their competition is what generated imperialist war. Now that we've changed to a new world in which the US is trying to maintain a monopoly over resources, over value production, and over military and political power, the situation is different, but this still remains the same. In order for capitalism to expand, in order for the US to maintain its monopoly, it needs to use violence in order to maintain that control and to continue expanding the market. But what it also needs to do is not only have a monopoly on resources, but also a monopoly on truth, which is why we are so often seeing and hearing this kind of ecosystem, full ecosystem of misinformation and a blockage of actually understanding how the world is today. Can you take us to the next slide, David? So I wanted to end with this quote from Comrade Mao. Does someone want to read it for us?
Imperialism and all reactionaries looked at in essence from a long-term point of view, from a strategic point of view, must be seen for what they are, paper tigers. On this we should build our strategic thinking. On the other hand, they are also living tigers, iron tigers, real tigers that can devour people. On this we should build our tactical thinking.
This is a kind of a summary of a longer quote from an interview that Mao did with Anna Louise Strong, who was an American journalist, a communist journalist who embedded in the Soviet Union and then in China and produced some of the most amazing English language, real life accounts of the revolutionary processes in Russia and then in China. And she did this long sit-down interview with Mao, and he was talking about the threat of imperialist war, of nuclear power, and he was kind of grasping the dialectic of the way in which imperialism exerts power against a people in resistance. And he says the key thing that I think we need to take, and this quote is also in the Hyper-imperialism booklet at the end, that at the same time as imperialism is a real tiger and can actually devour people, which we're seeing in front of our eyes, we're seeing it in real life, live streamed in Gaza. We're seeing it not live streamed, but we have the tools to understand it and grasp it in Venezuela. Over 100,000 people have died because of the consequences of sanctions. We're seeing how imperialism can actually devour people. They are iron tigers. At the same time, struggle can see through them completely. Because if we break the monopoly on truth, we also can see that imperialism has nothing for the future. That in fact it's creating its own conditions for its own failure. Mika ended on that point. We're seeing the decline of the economic production of the global north, even though it is trying to maintain its monopoly on resources and production and economic power. And this is how we have to think tactically. We're not just understanding imperialism so that we can passively watch it, but because we want to actually intervene in the contradictions that it's creating, in order to make sure that the next stage after hyper-imperialism, fully developed capitalism, is actually a system that is going to provide a future for the entirety of the world. And so there's two key reasons that we have to keep in mind for why US imperialism continues to operate in the way that it does. One, for capitalist expansion, but two, this monopoly on truth. Because if Cuba and Venezuela and China and Russia continue to provide real life examples in different ways, not all socialist, obviously. I did not just give you a list of all socialist countries. I'm going through countries that are trying to build an alternative to US rule. If they are showing us the reality that US imperialism actually cannot dominate the world, and we don't have to choose the path that US imperialism is putting for the people of the world, that is going to help generate more production of alternative paths. Even it's brought us to this room. I mean, what we saw when we see Palestine not being defeated and still resisting and growing the resistance is a big reason why a lot of us are in this room. We need those real life examples. We need the real life example of Cuba and of Venezuela. So we have to break the monopoly on truth. We need to be very smart in our tactics. We need to fight on all of those different spheres. And organized, we will win the global revolution, not just the one in our own countries. So thank you, Mika. Thank you, everyone. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so let's take a round from the room and then a round from the Zoom.
Hi. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, how do we contextualize the resistance of the imperialist hybrid war, like sanctions, within the Marxist theory? So, for example, like, is it possible to make a link between, like BRICS as a resistance to imperialist hybrid war, sanctions to dual power, or is the concept of like dual power something that we can only think about like within a revolution in the United States?
Thank you. My question is, what are some political organizations leading the anti-imperialist front in the United States that people in the course can consider joining, and how can we as revolutionaries help lead the anti-imperialist struggle and connect this struggle with the broader left in the United States? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mika, for the lecture. And my question will be, if the economic base for the rise of the global south is being expounded, we know it is there. Does this mean that the revolutionary process worldwide will be led by the global south, or the revolution will happen in the first world?
Should we take a couple more? Okay, wait.
In our class with Brian Becker, he talked about the ways in which the U.S. is preparing for a war with China. And I was wondering if you could speak to some spaces that you see for intervention into that sort of accumulation towards like potential nuclear war.
Yeah, I would like to add that one of the methods and the ways that imperialism succeeds is by implanting sleeping cells that could be sleeping for a long time. And then once the right moment comes, it grasps and controls. And we have, and they are really vicious sometimes. We have, in my opinion, we have a famous example in Egypt. Sisi was considered a sleeping cell because he at least for the years that Morsi have made him the defense minister, everybody thought that he is part of the brotherhood, Muslim brotherhood, and they trusted him. And then he overthrew the elected leader of Egypt. This method has been done earlier in the character of Lawrence of Arabia, who was also a British officer implanted to deceive, basically, deceive Arab leaders of the time. So I think this is one successful method that are not being there is not a lot of light focused on it. It is not being studied in counter-revolution studies. I just wanted to mention that point.
Thank you. I think that's a good amount of questions for interest of time.
Mika, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll tackle the ones that I think were mostly related to my content. The question, thank you all for the questions, great questions. I might not have full answers for all of them, but will the revolutionary processes be led in the global south was the one I heard, correct? They already are being led in the global south. There are many fronts, whether it's what's happening in Palestine with the Palestinian resistance, which completely, broke this feeling that it's a helpless situation, that it's business as usual. Can you guys fix your audio? It's muffled. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one is that it's already being led in different ways in the global south, whether it's Palestine, whether it's what's been happening in the Sahel with Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, basically ejecting the French, ejecting not only their military, but various imperialist interests, whether it's the fact that they're creating this AES, the Alliance of Sahelian States. This, even though they don't necessarily have socialist politics per se, we can all agree that there is an anti-imperialist, a clear anti-imperialist agenda that they're trying to pursue. And I think that is part of the leadership, or the leadership role that is being taken. The question, though, arises about how do we co-create and co-construct our anti-imperialist agenda, or common agenda. And the fact of the matter is, and somebody in the chat said they're from Jamaica and China sucks in Jamaica. Well, part of the dynamic and dilemma that we have as activists and grassroots organizers is that we enter into conditions not of our making, even though we can change them. We enter into conditions not of our own making. China entered into the international, global system in the 1978-79 and entered into conditions of its own making. It initially was like, we need to get strong with manufacturing, we need to get strong with production, because if we don't get strong in these areas, if we're not integrated, we won't be able to advance to a stage in which we can actually socialize the wealth with the people. I mean, China, they overcame extreme poverty in 2020, and it was not talked about in the African continent for reasons I'm sure that are about defaming China, etc. But the revolutionary processes are, one, already being led in the global south. But the question, and this is why we created this document and had to think about, and we need to still do deeper study on what is the global south, is how do we get our people to unite with one another when we also have governments in South Africa, in Namibia, well, Namibia is better, in Mozambique, in Jamaica, who don't act in the interest of their people, who don't act in the interest of the working class. That is one of the challenges that we often have to navigate, especially in this China-Africa conversation, because, for an example, a few years ago, the news was going around that apparently Uganda, the airport that was built by the Chinese, was going to be seized, that China was going to take over it and basically seize sovereign territory. This was a story that happened to be going around just before the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was meeting, which is basically when all the African leaders meet with China and make deals for cooperation in the future. But at the time, part of the issue there was not, it was wrong. They were not going to seize the airport because the Ugandans hadn't paid on their loans. What actually happened is that most of the people involved on the Ugandan side of that deal hadn't read the document, hadn't read the contract, hadn't asked for amendments, hadn't asked for negotiations, because they just saw a paycheck and said, well, this is going to be a quick buck for us. What they didn't see was the fact that it would take a long period to pay back the loan, the fact that there were certain constraints to their own budget in the process of having to pay back that loan. So we also have a failure of, leadership in our own countries that then disallow us to have full negotiating power when it comes to not even just China. We're seeing the rise of the Gulf states in Africa. We're seeing Turkey come in. We're seeing India play a significant role. But we, of course, need to fight on our national spheres. But in order for actually revolutionary processes to be unleashed, is one. But two, that we are seeing various forms of anti-imperialist struggle being led across the world. But the role of us as activists, like our comrades in West Africa, is how do we also push these processes to be further left? And it's no mistake that in Burkina Faso, he is not, what do you call it? Not mirroring, but the Burkina Faso leader, he sounds like Sankara to me. Like, his speeches are like Sankara reborn. But it's also because there's also been some political formation that has been pushed by leftists in the region. So it's also on us to kind of push the processes as far left as we can, even when they don't seem like it on the surface. And in terms of spaces of intervention around this, I think you guys just need to talk more about, like, what actually is China doing? Like, actually look at what China is doing. What are the developments in China? I will tell you, I've actually been living in China for the last year. I'm about to start my PhD in Shanghai in this September. And being in China, we can't all go to China, sadly, but being in China, you see for yourself that the lies that have been told about China do not serve the interests of the working class as a whole and their long-term interests. Yes, there are complications. Yes, there are experiments that fail and go bad. Yes, there are mistakes that are made along the way, but I've never seen such high quality standard of living in my whole life, where you can go to any part of the country and you'll find retired women's groups traveling around their own country, cycling, playing music together. Every single Sunday in China, I walk through the parks and there are huge groups of retirees playing brass band instruments, singing, dancing, karaokeing. And that is a qualitative difference from any other country in the world. There's not an African country I know where women A can retire and go as a group, unless they're upper middle class. Not even the middle class can do it anymore, and actually enjoy your life. So the quality of life in China has significantly changed. So one, I think it's important to talk about what actually is happening in China's own terms, and in terms of what it's done for the global south and what it does for the global south. Then two, I think in terms of space of intervention is we also just need to identify what are the key areas that are the US is fighting the hardest for. So for example, we just recently launched a study called, or not recently, like 2 months ago, and we'll actually have a discussion on the 18th of August, because I'm also part of a peace group called No Cold War, and we're going to have an event based on this dossier, which is about how the US is destabilizing Northeast Asia. And in the study, we realized that, Philippines, Japan, South Korea, all of these countries are strategic fronts of destabilizing or trying to destabilize not only Asia, but to target China. And so I think it will be important for us to better understand what are those relations. And it was just like a month ago, they had this huge military activity in the South China Sea, and Israel, it was a naval exercise, and Israel, who does not have any, South China's, or it was an exercise, RIMPAC. It was for any kind of Pacific Island related countries, anyone in the South China Sea. But somehow Israel, who has no border with the South China Sea or no access to the South China Sea, is involved in that. So I think it's important to raise the many ways in which the US is trying to galvanize its subordinated forces. But I think it's also important for activists to come together. So in this event we're going to have on the 18th, I think it is, I'll share with the coordinators to share with the group, is that we are trying to bring different activists from Asia to not only talk to each other and think together, but also to talk to the world and say, listen, here in Okinawa, we've been fighting for this military base to be removed. And if we don't have your support in the US fighting against US military spending, then we ourselves are not going to succeed in the struggle. So I think it's hard to say spaces of intervention. For me, it's all about being educated or trying to educate oneself about what is the actual reality, not coming from mouthpieces of empire. But two is to understand that if we support the struggles of the people in Okinawa by fighting the US military on domestic soil, you're having an impact in other parts of the world. And so to fight in your country is to also fight for others, because ultimately y'all have the hardest task. We will do our job. We need to kick them out in our places, as the Sahelian states did with the French. But we also need you guys to put, the final bullets to make sure that the corpse doesn't come back as a zombie or something. Oh, and one that I saw in the chat that I want to quickly mention. Somebody was asking, they don't believe that the Global South has a greater share of the world GDP. Let's be clear. There's the real economy, and then there's the speculative economy. The real economy is where we actually create things, like with value is added through our labor, where our surplus value is extracted in order to create specific commodities. Then there's the fictitious capital, the fictitious realm, the speculative realm, which is where there is more money. So the US does technically have more money, but the actual economic base that sustains the world at large is in the global south. So it's not to say the global south has more money. It's about the fact that we have in productive capacity a greater share. And if you look at manufacturing, for example, the greater productive capacity is in the global south right now. So I just wanted to clarify that. And you can see in the study that we also look at manufacturing, etc. So just to clarify that we're talking about the real economy, not the speculative economy, which is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars more. But if we don't have a larger share of the productive base, then we can't actually develop in the global south, because we need to build roads, we need to build power plants, we need to build renewable energy, etc. And you need a control over productivity and for it to actually be productive in order to advance.
Thank you, Mika. Yeah. So I know there's a lot more questions. There's a few more to answer from this round. I'm going to propose, because we're short on time, that maybe I'll just add a few things or catch a couple of questions that were missed, and that actually we find some time before the end of the course to have more discussion time on this topic. I mean, it is completely unrealistic to go into imperialism in one class. We knew that, but I mean, the whole course, in a sense, is giving you the tools to start a deeper study. And next module, we are spending more time to be talking about the actual potential for revolution in concrete terms for, in particular, the North America or the United States, where I think we'll have more time for particular discussion on tactics of struggle against imperialism and what that means, in fact, for the struggle for revolution across the world. We'll also be talking about the name of the class is Project 2025, but really what we mean by that is the next phase of repression on revolution inside and outside the United States. But just to catch a couple of the questions, there was one question about dual power and BRICS. Mika, you can jump in on this also, but I would hesitate to kind of categorize BRICS as a representative of dual power as opposed to imperialism, like in those clear-cut terms, because BRICS in and of itself, I don't think represents a socialist bloc or a cohesive bloc sharing the same exact program for the global working class. And the concept of dual power, we studied it in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution, where the revolutionary project was building its power alongside the power that had not yet been dismantled. And so BRICS in and of itself is an alternative. It represents a new mechanism, but not necessarily the same kind of consolidated bloc. That doesn't mean it's not something that's creating openings for us, but it isn't necessarily the same exact thing. And I think that's where Mika was heading towards, is that we actually have a task here, which is to define what that alternative is actually going to be. There was a slogan in the anti-globalization protests in the early 2000s, another world is possible. I hate that slogan. I actually can't stand that slogan in this phase of history. It was important in that phase of history. But in this phase of history, we need to define exactly what it is that we're building towards. And when we've studied national liberation struggles or anti-colonial struggles in the past, if you were in the Marxism and National Liberation course, or even the past couple of history sessions that we've done, every revolutionary comes to that point where it's not enough to actually fight against imperialism. You actually have to define what it is that you're building. So that's our extra task. There is a mass movement right now in the United States that is against US imperialism, objectively, even if people aren't consciously understanding what that means. I mean, to fight against the genocide in Palestine is to be against imperialism. Objectively, that's true. And it's probably the first time in a long time that we've had such a mass rejection of US imperialism. Our task is to make that conscious. We need to be the conscious element in there. We need to say, yes, everybody, we are actually on the same side, not just with each other, but with the global South, who is also fighting against imperialism. We have a common vision and a common objective. In that sense, just to add on that question of, is it going to be led by the global South or the global North? It's being led by the global South. The question is, do we join in? And what is our task in the United States? Not just to be in solidarity with the global South. We're not just in solidarity with Palestine. We actually need to build a revolution to end imperialism. If imperialism is the nature of capitalism that we are in right now, the only thing that will end it is the overthrowing of the system. So that's exactly what we have to do and what our task is. And then the question on which political organizations to join? Well, I'm going to open it up for all of you to answer. There's many representatives of political organizations in the room and on the Zoom, so you can introduce yourselves in the chat. The People's Forum is a great way to meet everybody, from political parties to mass movements to labor unions to education collectives. You can meet everybody. Everybody has a place to be. The question is, can you meet organizers, struggle with them, get to know them through struggle, not through Twitter or Instagram, but through shared struggle on the ground in conversations in real life. Because, you know, like Mika was saying about the revolutionary process in China, we are all human beings. Every organization is made up of human beings. There is no perfect organization. There is no perfect revolution. There's no perfect system in the world right now, but we can know where we belong and which path we want to be building and who we want to be building it with. What's the vehicle we're going to choose to build that with the majority of people across the world? And we'll get to know that by struggling together. So I'm glad we're all in this course together because it's giving us a chance to do that. Study and political education is also a form of struggle in many ways, and is going to be one of our main tasks as we, to counter this war drive against China, alongside struggling against the imperialist machine in this country. So I hope you do take time after class to introduce yourselves if you haven't yet. And we have another week still. And then, of course, the People's Forum will continue to be here and also take some time in the Zoom as we are wrapping up. Mika, I don't know if you have any other final words.
No, just thank you and appreciate all the active communication in the chat as well as all the thoughtful questions. And if you don't follow Tricontinental, do follow them because a lot of the things we've talked about, we cover a lot of that and have really great texts that are for the social movements, are for the kind of work we're trying to build on. So yeah, check out the Tricontinental. And if you can come to the event, I'll post it in the chat, the flyer. But that would be, great. So thank you everyone and hope you continue to study and struggle alongside one another.
All right. Thank you, Layan and Mika, again so much for an amazing class. And thank you all for staying over a little bit. I hope it was helpful. So, like Layan said, next week we're starting with our final module, Module 6, which is titled We Build the Future. We know that the imperialists and the ruling class has an agenda, and that's an agenda that wreaks havoc and destruction and genocide across the globe. And so we know that we need a people's agenda when we have a responsibility to explain and understand what that is and build that. So I hope to see you all next week. And last thing, this Saturday we're having our Saturday dialogue. It's going to be on the workers' front. We're going to be joined by two amazing comrades, so would love to see you all there. And we'll send out an email with the flyer that Mika talked about and any other updates. One more thing. On Saturday, right after the Saturday dialogue, we're going to be having, the PYM will be launching their Mask Off Maersk campaign. Maersk is a global logistics company that is responsible for the supply chain of death and shipping and manufacturing, or the manufacturement of all weapons. So it's going to be a really important launch, and so we'd love to see you all there. It will be at 4 p.m. Yeah, right after you have one break, you can get some coffee at Yafa and then join us back. So yeah, with that, thank you all. We'll see you on Saturday.